wrestling a little bit with quite a few things. I think I love that we're talking about multiple data sets and data points in order to try to dig through the racist and biased testing system that we have, both at the MCA level and the SAT, ACT level. And if we know where it comes from and why it's designed the way it is, and yet we still are trying to use it in a way that helps us as a system that we've all admitted is wrought with white supremacy, then like I feel like all of this discussion is great and it's further upstream, but it's not upstream enough. If we're truly focused on long-term liberation, why is it that we're not completely redesigning the whole shebang? And I guess that's what I'm wrestling with right now. And I don't know how to do that, to be honest. In my own school, we're working on that. It's tough because, we're perpetuating the same thing within our own space. I just wanted to share what I'm wrestling with in my head.
I've worked in a couple different systems, and I intentionally wanted Josh and Nate to be a part of the panel because not only are they two administrators that I totally respect and would be their assistant principal anytime, but they also come from two very different communities, right? So Nate at Minnetonka, Josh at BC, where at least I think last year it was 91% students of color and 9% white at BC. And so I think about like how we address this. It's interesting because although these standardized tests are critiqued heavily, I think, in the communities and districts that I've worked in the Twin Cities, especially from white liberal families, at the same time, when we're talking about like gifted and talented programming, AP classes, IB classes, those are some of the same voices that I often hear. So what's the criteria to be in this class? What's the criteria? Why are there, for me as a person of color, when I hear that, especially coming from white families around the Twin Cities, I tend to hear, so are you saying, is the class too integrated in terms of race? Are there too many EL students? What are you curious about? Because then we have community members that are like, well, what was their MAP score? Is there a certain percentile? Then, on one hand, standardized testing is demonized. And then on the other, I think about it in terms of, what Adam, you were kind of talking about with ACT testing. It's like, but then it's whiteness as property, and we can still use those data points to keep whiteness as property within a system. And I don't know if you want to talk to that, Nate, because you're at Minnetonka.
Just to be clear, I'm not from Minnetonka, and I haven't been there too long. The reality is standardized testing really does create and perpetuate material access for folks that have privilege. And so if you are a beneficiary of that, regardless of if you're in St. Paul or St. Louis Park or Minnetonka, I think when the rubber meets the road, I think you will find people are more apprehensive than not to upend the whole system, because for their kids or for someone that they care about, that standardized test or that honors levels course or that AP credit really does translate into real material access and opportunity. And I think it's important to take a holistic approach to understanding students' test scores, but I also think it's important to make sure that we're recognizing and complicating that conversation with the fact that these test scores produce benefits, and if we continue to create opportunities with the tests, then we have to think about who has access to those opportunities and who doesn't. So it's kind of a non-answer to your statement, but I want to highlight, Malachi, like in a school like mine, for a student to have an 8-point jump on their ACT after some studying and some practice, like they would not get flagged by ACT as somebody that possibly would have cheated, because in our environment, the expectation is that you take an ACT prep course. And if you do have privilege and resources, then you're taking prep courses that cost thousands of dollars and consistently and predictably produce those kind of score jumps for students.
So I want to start to address some of our audience questions. Thank you all for continuing the conversation so well. But one of our attendees asks, this gets to kind of, I think, where we're going. What do you see the future of standardized tests as? Do you take an optimistic view that we're all going to upend the system? What do you think?
So by upending the system, do we mean canceling standardized testing?
Up to you.
Okay. So so I think I looked at the data and I shared it with Gao this morning. Our district has one of the highest opt-out rates, right? St. Louis Park does, for MCA testing. And my conversation with our community, just like I would have at BC or in St. Paul, would be, fine, let's end standardized testing. I'm totally cool with that, but how does that change the racism within our system? Because what our standardized test does allow us to do is to continue to isolate which students are not being served in our system. Now, if we took standardized testing away, could we still do that? Absolutely. We could look at our restorative practices data. We could look at our suspension data. We could take a look at, the demographics of how our classes are made up and where are students of color in our system. But so my point is, just by taking away the standardized testing doesn't change the system. And that's what I'd rather upend, is the racism within the system.
Yeah, I would add, there's a part of me that at a systems level, standardized tests allow us to assess our own work. I think where this has become really muddy is standardized tests have been used to make judgments about students, and instead of allowing system leaders to have reflective conversations about the work that we're doing in support of our students and our communities. And so I wouldn't necessarily say I would advocate for throwing tests away, period. But how do we have a more critical approach to looking at our assessment data and evaluating what's happening at a systems level and evaluating what's happening in classrooms?
I used to be on the exact same page as Silvy and Nate. And I'm on a different page right now, and that is, let's throw it all out, start over. Oh, sorry, I'm in this new state of mind right now where abolish it. So like, what I would want to design is something that the local community context, which would be parents, community partners, and students, would design the accountability system within that community that's driving the outcomes that are designed as a community. That's something that I would love to see, and I honestly have no clue how to abolish it, and I have no clue how to redesign it. But I'm just in that headspace and emotional space right now. And the question I would pose is, if the current situation with COVID has caused us to stop doing certain things because of possible inequities, why was it just COVID that caused us to stop and analyze those inequities? And that's something that I'm, again, wrestling with.
I don't think COVID stopped us from testing in terms of addressing an inequity piece. I just think it's a health risk. And I think at the systems level, those test companies and the Department of Ed and even our own school district had to make calculations around, is this worth the risk? But I'm not so optimistic about what's going on in our systems that I believe that those things were put on hold because of inequity. We've had perpetual inequity for a really, really long time. And tests weren't stopped then. So it's, Josh, you're pulling me to your side of the argument slowly.
Yeah,